Welcome to the second episode in a Legendarium series about the life and reign of King Edward II of England. In this episode, Years of Disaster, we will talk about how he made peace with his rebellious cousin, the Earl of Lancaster, only to face twin disasters at the Battle of Bannockburn, followed by the Great Famine of 1315. Yet in the face of this adversity, Edward briefly governed England well, only to have these promising years spoiled by the rise of a new pair of royal favorites, the Despensers. And this led Edward into a second war against his cousin, the Earl of Lancaster. During the early years of Edward's reign, his favoritism to Piers Gaveston, his brother-in-arms, enraged the nobles of England. Edward II showered Gaveston with gold, jewels, land, and titles, while Gaveston insulted and mocked the great lords. When Edward's war in Scotland failed during the 1310s, the nobles made Gaveston a scapegoat for Edward's misgovernment. The king's own cousin, the Earl of Lancaster, ordered Gaveston beheaded for treason in 1312. For the rest of his life, Edward hated his cousin Lancaster, now the second most powerful man in England. For a time, Edward even considered leading a royal army against Lancaster to punish him, but his advisors talked him out of that, as it would leave England open to a Scottish invasion. Indeed, the king soon found relief from his mourning for Gaveston when his wife, Isabella of France, gave birth to the future King Edward III. In 1313, King Edward left England to witness the dubbing of 200 French knights by his father-in-law, King Philip IV of France. People turned out by the thousands to greet the English king. Parisians built a fountain that sprayed wine into the air and decorated it with mermaids and lions and leopards. Edward II donated 200 pigs, 200 carp, 80 barrels of wine, and 100 oxen for the royal feast with his father-in-law. And during the event, envoys from the Pope helped to broker peace between Edward and Lancaster. Together, the king and Lancaster raised funds for a renewed war against Robert the Bruce, who had very nearly retaken Scotland from the English. The Bruce had been laying siege to Stirling Castle since early 1314, just one of two Scottish forts still in English hands. Edward brought an army of 14,000 men, including many knights and archers. Robert the Bruce had about 5,000 men, including many spearmen. Though poorly trained, they could form deadly walls of spearheads called schiltrons against Edward's knights. When he learned of King Edward's approach, Robert the Bruce led his men 2 miles south from Stirling, placing them on a forested elevation called the New Park. The New Park was on an old Roman road that Edward had to take if he wished to reach Stirling Castle. Bruce then ordered his men to dig potholes along the side of a nearby river called the Bannockburn. The ground was already marshy, and the pits made it even more dangerous to horses and men. These potholes forced the English to bunch together on the old Roman road instead of using their numbers to surround the Scots. The first day of battle was mostly skirmishes between Scottish and English knights. An Englishman named Henry de Bohun challenged Robert the Bruce to single combat and died after the Bruce split his head in two with a battle axe. The same day, Scots spearmen took down whole parties of English knights, and on the second day, King Edward goaded the Earl of Gloucester into charging the Scottish spearmen, who butchered the English knights en masse. Only 500 Scots died to 4,000 English. As his army melted away, King Edward II fled for his life. Edward's horse was killed under him, and he had to fight off Scots soldiers with a mace. With an escort of 500 men, Edward fled Scotland in a boat, leaving thousands of his men behind. Even worse, the Earl of Lancaster and his allies had refused to join Edward II in battle, hoping that the king would be defeated without them, and then they could force Edward to govern England as they pleased, since they hadn't lost all of their men at Bannockburn. On top of that, a triumphant Robert the Bruce sent his brother, Edward the Bruce, into Ireland to destroy the English colony on its eastern coast and establish a united kingdom of Scotland and Ireland that could rival England itself. At first, Edward the Bruce won great victories in Ireland, but the weather soon turned against him and all Christendom. From May to October 1315, seemingly endless rain swept away villages, ruined farmland, and created massive lakes in low-lying countryside. The British Isles plunged into a terrible famine that lasted for 2 years. Crop yields dropped by 80%. Whole villages were reduced to begging. People ate bird droppings, pets, rotten wheat, and dug up the dead to eat their flesh. Mob violence erupted over scraps of food. Of the 3 million people living in Britain, about 300,000 died. Facing both military and human disaster, the king and Lancaster met to reform the government. At first, they agreed to replace corrupt sheriffs and ministers, and then they tried to address the famine by pressing hoarders to release food and make trade within England easier. However, Lancaster was mainly thinking about making certain that he could stop his cousin from slipping back into bad habits. And once Lancaster believed he had done that, Lancaster simply retreated to Pontefract Castle in the north. And the years that followed offered hope. Edward II began waking up early, paying attention to Parliament, and showing mercy in court cases. Edward also had a second son, named John, with Queen Isabella in 1316, followed by Princess Eleanor in 1318. Ironically, the famine doomed the Scottish invasion of Ireland, as the Scots grew desperate for food and began taking crops from the native Irish at sword point, which made the Scots seem like just another invading army. In 1318, Edward II sent reinforcements to Ireland led by the Earl of Louth, who crushed Edward the Bruce at the Battle of Faughart. Louth sent King Edward II Edward the Bruce's head as a trophy, and this victory ended Robert the Bruce's hopes for a Scot-Irish union and gave the barons hope not only for the Scottish Wars but for King Edward II in general. However, Edward's tendency towards obsession with favorites ruined this early promise. Even during the heady days when he was reforming government and successfully fighting the Scots in Ireland, he found a new set of arrogant and ambitious playmates in Hugh Despenser the Elder and his son, also called Hugh Despenser the Younger. Like Gaveston, they were conniving and greedy, using the king's favor to snap up estates across Wales, including Cardiff and Caerphilly. Despenser men seized the estates of their rivals by armed force backed up by royal writ, and if anyone sought justice from King Edward II, the Despensers conveniently controlled access to him. However, in 1320, the Despenser men went too far. When the Countess of Gloucester died, her lordship was contested between several great earls. Ignoring their competing claims, Edward II swooped in and gave Gloucester to Despenser the Younger. The Marcher Lords, powerful English nobles who ruled Wales, were outraged by this blatant favoritism. In early 1321, the Marcher Lords invaded the Despenser estates in Wales. Huge bands of armed men swept through South Wales, plundering manor houses, breaking down the fences of hunting preserves, and slaughtering the animals inside. Though they flew royal banners and claimed loyalty to the king, they in fact served rebel barons who wished to cleanse Edward's court of the evil Despenser influence. Lancaster, who watched these troubling events from the north, decided that King Edward II had slid back into bad habits, and he joined a parliament at Westminster that demanded the Despenser men be exiled. While it looked bad for a king to cave in, Edward had a way out. If his wife begged him to make peace on her knees, the king could cave in while saving face. Queen Isabella did just that, begging the king to exile the Despensers for the sake of England, which he did, briefly. During the Despensers' brief exile, King Edward II gathered allies like the Earls of Kent, Pembroke, Arundel, and Surrey, who hoped to become royal favorites themselves by supporting the king against Lancaster. Despite his political stupidity, King Edward II proved an able battlefield commander, winning a series of quick victories over the Marcher lords. In February 1322, word leaked that Lancaster had been secretly negotiating with the Scots to ally with him against King Edward II. Before the Earl of Lancaster could claim to be a patriot rebel trying to save England from a treacherous king, now men saw Lancaster as the real traitor. A panicked Lancaster fled toward Scotland, where he was caught by royalist forces. King Edward II imprisoned Lancaster in a tower, where Lancaster himself had planned to lock up the king. Lancaster then faced the same fate he doled out to Piers Gaveston 10 years ago. He went before a kangaroo court and was not allowed to speak in his defense, and very quickly found guilty. Edward's axemen cut Lancaster's head off. Though it might look just a beheading for a beheading, no royal earl had been executed in England since the Norman conquest 260 years ago. His father, Edward I, governed England for twice as long as Edward II without killing a single nobleman. And the deaths did not end there. Soon gibbets held the bodies of Lancaster's allies, hung in chains. 20 more rebel lords followed, their bloated and rotting corpses swinging from chains for more than 2 years. In a sign of just how much people soured on King Edward II and his cruel revenge, people came to believe that Lancaster was a martyr and saint, traveling to his tomb and his gallows to be healed and to pray. How much longer could Edward's behavior be tolerated? We'll find out in the next episode. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.